change, I believe in, is not one that happens through one or two or even through election cycles or even through electoral politics on its own terms, but it happens from movements from below, people's movements. That has been the history of our times, our turbulent history. And to me, it's a fantasy to believe that a single person, man or woman, political superman or superwoman, can in a single bound transform this political system. So it is this movement from below. And hitched to that and is an understanding, a recognition that we are living in a system hardwired to resist fundamental reform, a political environment forged by corporate money and power, and that it will take these movements, sustained, patient, organizing, and smart, what I would call inside-outside strategies. And this is where I sometimes differ with allies and friends, but I do think you need people inside. You need people who, like, I mean, I think of Elizabeth Warren, who's now running, but you need people like people across this country. And there are people, by the way, in movements who are beginning to say, I'm going to also run, because the best political leaders are those who come out of movements, whether it's a consumer movement or an environmental movement, a women's rights movement, something that's rooted in their lives, but stay connected to that movement once they're in a position of influence, because then they're anchored. And it's up to us as movements to continue to hold them accountable and to work with them. I think it's so important to have that sense of movements, of patience, but also of the ability to make change, that people can make change working together, which we have now. Because if you don't have that, you have what the great historian of populism, Lawrence Goodwin, once described as the, quote, mass resignation of people who believe in, quote, the dogma of democracy on a superficial public level, but whose hearts no longer burn with the conviction that they are part of the deal. And we need to be part of that deal. We need to believe that we can make change. So to me, these are essential themes in my columns. And it's not going to be short term. So I look at, in this book, the promise, as I described, of the movements emerging. This, to me, I have to say, I don't know how you feel, but to me, one of the reasons I think we reached this tipping point is that in people's guts, they feel this obscene inequality colliding with a downward mobility. Now, the American dream has never been a reality. It has been beleaguered from day one. It didn't include millions of people, but it has been part of our ethos. And I think people see now that that is not in their lives, or their friends' lives, their families' lives. And to me, that has lit the spark, which we're now witnessing. And as we think ahead, and I'm sure you've been thinking too, how we move the energy, the anger, the passion of Occupy into forging, this is where I sometimes think we need a new vocabulary because this seems so old to speak, new strategies for a new politics, a new economy that is more human, humane. I'm also, as I said earlier, hopeful that this has shifted and pushed a corporate media. And by the way, it shouldn't be called a mainstream media. We can talk about what a mainstream media is, because the mainstream media isn't really covering the mainstream. It's, if you think about what the mainstream values or principles or ideas are in this country, they're often treated as fringe or marginal in too much of what is in the mainstream. But the idea of challenging the limits of our dialogue and debate, or what I would call the suffocating consensus, or the need to redefine the center so that it is not the center we're told it is, but it is a center that is closer to the way people are actually living. It's not the center that political operatives or pundits or the Washington consensus believe.
I know there was a Gilded Age, and your nation started in 1865 with the paper, and I just read a book called Railroaded.
About the railroad business?
About the railroad business, and how that was under the gold standard, but they were giving away bonds and funding to the railroads. In effect, we had a paper money, a paper currency going that created a lot of the Gilded Age robber barons, if you will. Now, we've taken ourselves off the gold standard and we've become essentially run the government monopoly of the banks. And that has created so much distortion in our system. Because as a businessman, I can't print money to pay my people.
But you know,
But as a politician, we're empowering politicians with that.
This may not be a full answer to your question, but I do think, and this is partly inspired by Bill Grider's work on the Federal Reserve, I think, quote, wonky quantitative easing has been important in terms of a stimulus, because you need a kind of Keynesianism short-term stimulus. Look at what's going on in Europe.
Never worked.
Look at what's going on in Europe.
It's never worked.
Well, it's averting a greater depression.
impossible.
And austerity in Europe makes us look at our economic politics and realize there's been a little bit of a jolt of Keynesianism in the system. But if they do an austerity program in Europe, it will be much tougher to resolve that crisis. And I don't think it has to do with the currency. I think it has to do, if I might, with the last 40 years of, and Jeff Madrick writes about this well in a book called The Age of Greed, which I recommend to you, but the hyper-financialization of our economy. It's not an immaculate conception. It might be original sin, but it's not immaculate conception. No, that we have these huge conglomeratized investment firms. And by the way, one of the simple reforms that the New Deal put through, which the Nation editorialized about and against, was the repeal of Glass-Steagall under the Clinton administration. And that was one of the barriers to some of the risks we have seen. And so I would put more onus on that as opposed to the currency issue.
How much do you think Occupy may have to do with the young people wanting to communicate via Twitter and the various different devices, as much as deal with specific concrete issues and provide solutions?
I think
it's going to take a lot to do.
I think one of the exciting elements, and this is I see close up with Occupy Wall Street, is that there is, and Joanne Wipachewski, who's a very interesting writer for us, wrote about this, that there were young people coming to the square, excited that they were talking to me.
Yeah.
No, I mean really,
Yeah.
that they were in communication, the
Yeah.
General Assembly, people,
Yeah.
that it wasn't sitting in front of a laptop
Right.
and feeling sort of alienated from. Now, that doesn't mean they're not then using, and I've spent time at the Media Center at Occupy Wall Street downtown, that they're not using the new technologies in brilliant ways to avoid a mainstream defining who they are. They're getting their message out, they're coordinating with other encampments around the country. And I certainly think that the new media has been very important, but you need the offline, and you need that communication. And I think that's